Stop for a moment and listen carefully, because this could change how you see your faith from today on. What if some of the habits you consider private are quietly shaping your spiritual strength, your peace, and even your future in ways you never imagined? Many believers love God sincerely, pray often, and try to live rightly, yet still feel distant, conflicted, or weighed down by an inner tension they can't fully explain. What if the issue isn't your faith, your commitment, or your devotion, but what happens in moments no one else sees? In the next minutes, you'll understand why knowing what Christians should never do in intimacy can guard your conscience, protect your spiritual sensitivity, and bring clarity to areas where confusion has silently taken root. This message is not about fear, shame, or condemnation. It's about wisdom, alignment, and reclaiming spiritual peace. Have you ever wondered why certain inner struggles keep repeating, or why your prayers sometimes feel unheard or ineffective? What if avoiding a few critical mistakes could restore confidence, strengthen your walk with God, and renew your sense of purpose? Stay until the end, because these truths are rarely discussed openly, yet they hold the power to reshape how you view intimacy, faith, and the direction of your life from this moment forward. Before we continue, if this message already makes sense to you, take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel. That way, you stay connected to content that helps you grow in faith and stay spiritually strong. What a Christian should never do in intimacy is normalize hidden behavior that the conscience has already warned about, because what you repeatedly hide eventually begins to control you. There is a moment, often subtle, when the heart knows something is off long before the mind admits it. That quiet pause before opening a screen late at night, the inner check before returning to a private habit after a stressful day, or the discomfort felt when the room goes silent. The danger begins when that signal is ignored often enough to become background noise. Intimacy then stops being a place of connection and becomes a place of escape, like someone using distractions to avoid emotional pain. And escape always asks for more. Many believers don't fall suddenly. They drift slowly, one private choice at a time, telling themselves it's harmless, temporary, or manageable. That is exactly why this pattern is so powerful. It doesn't shock the soul, it sedates it. Hidden behavior reshapes how you experience God without you noticing at first. Prayer may still happen, but it feels thinner, rushed, or mechanical, like reading words without presence. Worship may still sound the same, but it feels distant, as if something invisible is blocking depth. The problem isn't that faith disappeared. It's that intimacy trained the heart to switch off spiritual awareness when it mattered most. This creates an internal contradiction where the spirit desires closeness, but habits pull in the opposite direction. For example, someone may feel motivated during church but disconnected once alone. That tension produces restlessness, guilt without clarity, and a feeling of being spiritually stuck. The believer keeps asking why growth feels slow, not realizing the anchor is being dropped in private moments. What makes this even more dangerous is how quickly justification replaces conviction. The mind begins creating reasons instead of seeking truth. Comparisons appear, such as thinking others struggle more, or that this is minor compared to bigger sins. Thoughts like everyone struggles, it's not hurting anyone, or God understands start to repeat. While grace is real, grace was never meant to be used as anesthesia for the conscience. When justification takes over, the heart stops asking the most important question: is this drawing me closer or quietly pulling me away? In real life, this looks like ignoring discomfort and moving on. The longer that question goes unasked, the harder it becomes to hear the answer when it finally matters. Over time, hidden intimacy begins to redefine satisfaction. What once felt enough now feels empty. What once brought relief now brings craving. This is how control shifts. Instead of intimacy serving the believer begins serving the habit. Focus weakens at work, discipline fades in routines, and motivation drops without explanation. Spiritual confidence quietly erodes. Many people don't realize they are losing authority in prayer or clarity in decisions because the connection between private behavior and public strength is rarely discussed. Yet the connection is real and visible in everyday life, especially when decisions feel foggy and conviction feels weak. Another effect most people don't expect is emotional numbness. When the heart learns to suppress conviction, it doesn't selectively mute one feeling, it lowers the volume on everything. Joy feels shorter, peace feels fragile, and gratitude becomes shallow. This leads many believers to chase intensity elsewhere, such as constant entertainment or overworking, hoping to feel alive again. Yet the root remains untouched. The soul was never designed to thrive while divided. Alignment is not restriction. It is protection. In real life, alignment restores calm, clarity, and emotional stability without needing constant stimulation. Here is the thought to hold on to as we move forward. If something must stay hidden to survive, what does that say about its influence over your heart? This is not about exposure to others, but honesty before God and yourself. Many people notice real change when they stop hiding and start confronting patterns quietly and sincerely. If one hidden pattern can weaken clarity, peace, and spiritual authority, imagine what happens when intimacy is realigned instead of concealed. The next truth goes even deeper, touching areas most believers never connect to intimacy, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. What a Christian should never do in intimacy is allow desire to lead without discernment, because when desire becomes the guide, values slowly become negotiable. Desire is not the enemy, but it is a powerful force that demands direction. In everyday life, this often begins after emotional fatigue, loneliness, rejection, or stress, when the heart looks for immediate relief instead of reflection. It can look like scrolling longer than planned, revisiting old habits when feeling overwhelmed, or seeking emotional comfort without stopping to ask what it will cost later. When desire is left unchecked, it never stays contained. It grows, adapts, and asks for more permission each time. Many believers miss this shift because nothing dramatic happens at first. Life looks normal. On the outside, routines continue, responsibilities are met. Yet internally, the heart starts prioritizing how something feels in the moment over what it produces long-term. That quiet exchange slowly weakens spiritual clarity without sounding any alarms. When desire leads without discernment, boundaries stop feeling firm and start feeling flexible. What once felt clearly wrong now feels negotiable depending on mood, exhaustion, or circumstances. In real life, this shows up in thoughts like just this once, I deserve this, or I'll deal with it later. Over time, discernment gets replaced by impulse, and impulse never asks where it's taking you. A believer may notice they make decisions faster, with less reflection, especially in private. This pattern doesn't just stay in intimacy. It spills into everyday choices, like skipping prayer, delaying responsibilities, or avoiding difficult conversations. The danger isn't one isolated moment, but the habit of letting desire decide repeatedly. Patterns shape character far more than intentions ever will, and once a pattern forms, it becomes the default response under pressure. This shift quietly affects decision-making beyond intimacy. When desire leads in private, it begins influencing choices in public. A believer may notice increased impatience, reduced self-control, or difficulty staying committed to healthy routines. Saying no becomes harder, not only to temptation, but to distractions, unhealthy relationships, or unnecessary commitments. This happens because the heart has been trained to obey what feels strongest rather than what is wisest. Discernment weakens when it isn't exercised, just like a muscle that loses strength when unused. In real life, this may look like constantly reacting instead of choosing, feeling busy yet unfulfilled, or wondering why discipline feels harder than it used to, even though nothing obvious has changed. Another overlooked effect is how desire-led intimacy distorts expectations. Satisfaction becomes delayed, and contentment feels just out of reach. What once brought calm now brings anticipation followed by emptiness. Many believers repeat the cycle, hoping the next time will finally satisfy, without realizing the issue isn't intensity, but direction. In everyday life, this shows up as frustration with oneself, quiet disappointment, and a sense that something is missing despite having moments of pleasure. Desire was never designed to carry the weight of purpose or fulfillment. When it is forced into that role, it collapses under pressure and leaves the heart wanting more, not better. Emotionally, this creates instability. When desire governs intimacy, emotions fluctuate more intensely. Confidence rises briefly, then crashes. Motivation appears, then disappears. Peace becomes fragile. This emotional inconsistency often spills into spiritual life, where prayer feels passionate one day and empty the next. The believer may begin questioning their faith, assuming something is wrong spiritually, when the real issue is misalignment. In practical terms, this can look like starting strong spiritual routines and abandoning them quickly, or feeling close to God only during emotional highs. Desire-led living produces emotional highs and lows because it lacks an anchor, and without an anchor, the heart drifts easily. Hold this question as we continue. If desire is always asking for more, who decides when enough is enough? Discernment does not suppress desire, it orders it. When desire is guided instead of obeyed, clarity returns, peace stabilizes, and confidence strengthens. Many believers notice real change when they pause before acting and ask what this choice is training their heart to love. The next truth exposes another subtle mistake that feels harmless at first, yet quietly undermines spiritual strength and intimacy in ways most people never connect, until the damage is already done. What a Christian should never do in intimacy is disconnect actions from responsibility, because when consequences are ignored, maturity stops growing. This mindset often forms quietly, without rebellion or intention. In real life, it begins with thoughts like nothing bad happened last time, I still feel fine, or this doesn't affect anyone else. The action feels contained, controlled, and separate from the rest of life. Yet every choice shapes the inner structure of the heart, even when no immediate consequence appears. Just like eating poorly doesn't cause instant illness but slowly weakens the body, repeated unexamined choices weaken spiritual maturity. Responsibility is not about blame, it is about formation. When actions are repeated without ownership, the soul learns that choices do not require reflection. That belief silently trains avoidance instead of growth, making it harder to stand firm later when temptation or pressure becomes stronger and more demanding. When responsibility is removed, accountability begins to feel unnecessary or even uncomfortable. A believer may stop asking hard questions like, why do I keep returning to this? Or what is this teaching my heart? In daily life, this looks like continuing the same patterns while assuming God will simply overlook growth areas without personal engagement. Grace becomes misunderstood as permission instead of power for transformation. Over time, spiritual discipline weakens. Prayer becomes reactive, only happening when guilt surfaces, instead of intentional and consistent. Reflection becomes shallow, and repentance turns vague, without specific change. Responsibility was never meant to produce shame, it produces clarity. Without clarity, faith remains sincere but stagnant, and the believer wonders why progress feels slow despite genuine belief. This disconnect also changes how conviction is experienced. Instead of being received as guidance, conviction starts feeling like an inconvenience. The heart rushes past moments of inner tension to avoid discomfort. In real life, this often shows up as constant distraction, background noise, or staying endlessly busy to avoid silence. Silence invites reflection, and reflection demands responsibility. When conviction is ignored repeatedly, it doesn't disappear. It waits beneath the surface. Later, it often resurfaces during moments of stress, failure, or emotional exhaustion, carrying more weight than before. The believer may feel overwhelmed without understanding why, not realizing unresolved responsibility has been accumulating quietly over time. Another consequence many don't expect is weakened integrity. Integrity is not built in public moments. It is formed when actions and values remain aligned in private. When intimacy is separated from responsibility, a gap opens between belief and behavior. That gap creates internal friction. The believer may feel tired without clear cause, unmotivated even when life is stable, or disconnected despite active faith practices. This emotional drain comes from carrying two versions of the self. Integrity does not collapse suddenly. It erodes slowly when responsibility is delayed, minimized, or avoided. Over time, this erosion reduces confidence, clarity, and spiritual authority. Responsibility also shapes emotional resilience. When believers practice ownership over private choices, they build inner strength to handle external pressure. Without that habit, small challenges feel heavier than they should. Stress tolerance decreases. Emotional reactions intensify. In real life, this might look like overreacting to criticism, feeling defeated by normal setbacks, or needing constant reassurance to feel stable. The heart hasn't been trained to carry weight because it hasn't practiced responsibility consistently. Avoidance weakens endurance, while ownership strengthens it quietly over time. Hold this question as we move forward. If every repeated choice is building something inside you, what kind of strength forms when responsibility is postponed? Responsibility does not remove joy or peace. It protects them. When intimacy is paired with ownership instead of avoidance, growth accelerates naturally. Clarity increases. Confidence stabilizes. And alignment replaces inner tension. The next truth reveals another mistake that feels harmless at first glance, yet slowly reshapes identity in ways most believers never connect to intimacy until much later. What a Christian should never do in intimacy is allow emotional emptiness to be mistaken for emotional connection, because filling a void is not the same as healing it. Emotional emptiness often appears quietly, disguised as tiredness, loneliness, or the sense of being unseen. In real life, this usually surfaces after long workdays, unresolved conflicts, unmet expectations, or seasons where prayer feels routine instead of alive. The heart feels heavy but can't explain why. In those moments, intimacy can shift from connection to emotional anesthesia. Instead of asking what is hurting, the heart looks for something that feels good quickly. Many believers don't notice this transition because it feels natural, even deserved. Yet relief and healing are not the same. Relief numbs pain, healing transforms it. When intimacy is used to mute emptiness, the pain pauses briefly, only to return stronger later. When emotional emptiness is confused with connection, fulfillment standards quietly drop. What once required meaning, presence, and depth now only requires distraction. In daily life, this looks like turning to intimacy out of boredom, stress, or emotional overload rather than genuine closeness. The heart stops asking why it feels empty and starts asking how to escape the feeling as fast as possible. Over time, this trains avoidance. Instead of processing disappointment through reflection, prayer, journaling, or honest conversation, emotions are bypassed. This avoidance feels efficient, but unresolved emotions don't disappear. They settle deeper, shaping mood, motivation, and patience. Many believers feel irritable or unfulfilled without knowing the cause, not realizing emotional needs were postponed instead of addressed. This pattern slowly reshapes how connection itself is defined. Emotional depth becomes optional, while stimulation becomes central. True connection starts to feel slow, demanding, or even uncomfortable. In real life, this shows up as impatience with silence, discomfort with vulnerability, and difficulty staying emotionally present with others. Conversations feel shallow. Moments meant to build closeness feel rushed. The heart becomes used to intensity without intimacy. As a result, even after intimate moments, a strange loneliness remains. This confusion leads many to repeat the cycle, assuming the problem was timing or intensity, not recognizing that connection requires presence, not escape. Spiritually, this creates quiet disorientation. When emotional emptiness is consistently masked, spiritual sensitivity dulls. Prayer may still happen, but it feels dry or distant. Scripture feels less personal. Worship feels emotionally flat. The believer may wonder what changed, assuming faith weakened. In reality, the heart has been trained to seek comfort somewhere else first. Over time, spiritual practices are unconsciously judged by how quickly they soothe emotions. When they don't provide immediate relief, discouragement sets in. This shifts trust away from spiritual nourishment toward emotional shortcuts, weakening long-term spiritual stability. Another real-life consequence is emotional dependency. When intimacy becomes the primary coping mechanism, the heart loses flexibility. Stress feels heavier. Loneliness feels sharper. Peace becomes conditional on access to relief. Emotional regulation weakens. In everyday life, this may look like mood swings, irritability, difficulty focusing, or feeling unsettled even when circumstances are stable. Small frustrations feel overwhelming. The heart hasn't learned how to sit with discomfort, process emotions, and heal. Emotional emptiness was never meant to be silenced. It was meant to be understood. Hold this question as we continue. If intimacy is used to escape emptiness, when does the emptiness ever get healed? True connection restores because it requires presence, honesty, and patience. When emotional needs are addressed at the root, intimacy returns to its rightful place instead of carrying a burden it was never designed to hold. The next truth reveals another mistake that feels normal, even responsible, yet quietly reshapes identity, confidence, and spiritual direction over time. One of the most subtle mistakes believers fall into during intimate moments is assuming that consistency automatically means spiritual alignment, when in reality repetition without awareness slowly turns intention into autopilot. In everyday life, routine feels responsible and safe. It looks like doing the same things at the same times, with no visible chaos or conflict. A believer may think, nothing feels wrong, so nothing needs attention. Days pass, habits repeat, and intimacy becomes familiar instead of examined. Yet alignment is not preserved by repetition alone. When actions are no longer questioned, the heart stops asking why it chooses what it chooses. Intimacy becomes mechanical, disconnected from purpose, similar to driving the same road daily without noticing where it leads. Habits don't just repeat behavior, they reinforce direction, shaping the future quietly while the present feels comfortable. When routine replaces alignment, spiritual sensitivity gradually dulls. The believer may stop noticing inner signals that once mattered deeply. Conviction feels weaker, not because it vanished, but because attention drifted elsewhere. In real life, this looks like praying out of habit without presence, reading scripture without reflection, or engaging in intimacy without intention. Everything appears functional, yet something feels muted. The heart becomes efficient but not alive. Over time, this dullness spreads beyond intimacy. Passion fades, curiosity about growth weakens, and the believer may assume this flatness is normal maturity or adulthood. In reality, awareness was replaced by autopilot, and autopilot never asks whether the soul is still aligned. Another hidden effect of unexamined routine is how it reshapes expectations. When intimacy becomes automatic, the heart quietly lowers its standards for depth and meaning. Growth feels optional. Change feels unnecessary. In daily life, this shows up as thoughts like "this is just how things are now" or "I've already dealt with this before." That mindset slowly closes the door to transformation. Routine provides comfort, but it does not correct direction. Without reflection, habits are never challenged, and what remains unchallenged eventually becomes identity. The believer doesn't choose stagnation, it simply settles in unnoticed. Spiritually, this creates a form of stagnation that is difficult to detect because nothing appears broken. There is no crisis, no public failure, no dramatic warning sign. Scripture feels familiar but no longer revealing. Prayer feels consistent but not renewing. Worship feels stable but lacks depth. The believer may wonder why inspiration is gone, assuming something external is missing. In reality, intimacy has been operating without intention. Alignment requires adjustment, and adjustment requires awareness. When awareness fades, growth stalls even if behavior still looks correct on the surface. Emotionally, routine without alignment produces subtle dissatisfaction. Life feels full but not fulfilling. The believer stays busy, productive, and responsible, yet senses a quiet restlessness underneath it all. This often leads to seeking novelty elsewhere, not because something is wrong externally, but because something is missing internally. In real life, this may look like chasing new distractions, overworking, or craving intensity to feel alive again. Intimacy was never meant to be mindless. When it becomes routine without reflection, it loses its ability to strengthen the soul and stabilize emotions. Hold on to this question as we approach the final truth. If habit is guiding your actions, who is checking the direction? Alignment does not demand constant change, but it does require attention. When intimacy is guided by awareness instead of autopilot, clarity returns and growth resumes naturally. The next and final insight reveals a mistake many believers make without realizing it, one that quietly determines whether intimacy becomes a source of strength or a slow erosion of spiritual identity. The final and most overlooked danger in intimacy is allowing it to shape identity instead of flowing from identity, because when intimacy defines who you are, stability is replaced by fluctuation. In real life, this happens quietly, when a believer begins tying self-worth, confidence, or emotional security to private experiences instead of a grounded sense of identity in faith. On days when intimacy feels satisfying, life feels lighter, prayer feels easier, and confidence rises. On days when it does not, insecurity creeps in, motivation drops, and spiritual doubt appears. The issue is not intimacy itself, but the weight placed on it. Identity was never meant to be built on experiences, because experiences change with mood, stress, and circumstance. When intimacy becomes the source of identity, the heart becomes emotionally reactive, constantly adjusting to highs and lows it cannot control. When identity is shaped by intimacy, self-perception becomes unstable and inconsistent. A believer may feel valuable when intimacy feels controlled or fulfilling, and unworthy when it does not. In everyday life, this shows up as unexplained mood shifts, sudden loss of confidence, or questioning one's spiritual standing based on recent private moments. Someone may wake up feeling strong and focused one day, then feel spiritually distant the next, without any external reason. Confidence rises and falls quickly. Peace becomes conditional. Instead of identity anchoring intimacy, intimacy begins defining identity. This reversal creates internal pressure, because the heart constantly seeks experiences to confirm worth. Over time, this pressure leads to emotional exhaustion, as the soul works harder to feel secure instead of resting in who it already is. This mistake also quietly distorts spiritual confidence. When intimacy influences identity, spiritual authority becomes inconsistent. Prayer may feel bold one moment and hesitant the next. Faith feels strong, then fragile. In real life, this often looks like believers holding back from praying, serving, or stepping into leadership because they feel unqualified based on private struggles. They may think they need to feel spiritually clean before acting, rather than acting from who they already are. Identity becomes performance-based instead of rooted. This creates a cycle of waiting to feel worthy before moving forward, which delays growth and limits impact without the believer realizing why progress feels stalled. Another real-world consequence is comparison. When identity feels unstable, the heart looks outward for reassurance. Believers may compare themselves to others, assuming everyone else is more disciplined, more aligned, or more spiritually consistent. This comparison breeds shame and discouragement. Instead of drawing closer to growth, the believer pulls back, feeling behind or disqualified. In daily life, this may look like withdrawing from community, avoiding spiritual conversations, or silently judging oneself. Intimacy was never meant to determine spiritual rank or value. When it takes that role, it becomes a measuring tool it was never designed to be, distorting perspective and damaging confidence. Emotionally, identity shaped by intimacy creates dependency instead of stability. The heart becomes reactive rather than grounded. Stress feels heavier. Failure feels personal. Success feels temporary. In real life, This can look like overthinking private moments, harsh self-criticism, or feeling spiritually unstable during normal seasons of life. Small setbacks feel overwhelming because identity feels fragile. The soul was designed to draw identity from truth, not from fluctuating experiences. When that order is reversed, emotional balance becomes difficult to maintain, and peace feels constantly at risk. Hold on to this final question as everything comes together. If intimacy were removed for a season, would your identity remain intact? True spiritual strength is formed when intimacy flows from identity, not when identity is built upon intimacy. When identity is rooted in faith and truth, clarity stabilizes, peace deepens, and intimacy takes its rightful place as an expression rather than a foundation. This is where freedom begins, where confidence becomes steady, and where lasting alignment is finally restored. Now bring all of this together, because the most dangerous part of these mistakes is not that they are shocking, but that they feel normal. Most believers don't wake up intending to drift, weaken, or feel divided. It happens quietly, through small private choices repeated without reflection. Each pattern we explored connects to one central truth. Intimacy always shapes something, either strengthening alignment or slowly eroding it. In real life, many people sense this erosion through fatigue, confusion, emotional instability, or a loss of spiritual confidence they can't explain. These signals are not random. They are invitations to pause, reflect, and realign before habits harden into identity. What changes everything is awareness. When a believer becomes conscious of how intimacy affects the heart, choices regain power. Instead of reacting automatically, the soul begins responding intentionally. In everyday life, this looks like pausing before acting, recognizing emotional triggers, and asking what a choice is training the heart to love. This awareness restores authority, because authority is not about perfection, but alignment. The moment intimacy stops operating in isolation and starts flowing from identity, clarity returns. Peace stabilizes. Emotional swings soften. Spiritual confidence rebuilds, not overnight, but steadily and deeply. Many believers wait for a breaking point before making changes, assuming growth only comes after failure. But wisdom allows course correction before damage accumulates. In real life, this means you don't need a crisis to realign, you need honesty. Small adjustments in private moments produce massive shifts over time. When intimacy is guided by truth instead of impulse, by responsibility instead of avoidance, and by identity instead of emotion, it becomes a source of strength rather than tension. That is where freedom lives, not in restriction, but in order. As you reflect on everything you've heard, ask yourself this honestly. Which of these patterns felt uncomfortably familiar? Awareness is the first step toward restoration. If this message brought clarity, don't rush past it. Sit with it. Let it expose what needs alignment, not condemnation. If this message spoke directly to you, don't let it end here. Take one intentional step right now. Subscribe to this channel so you stay connected to teachings that protect your faith, strengthen your discipline, and bring clarity to areas most people avoid discussing. These videos are designed to help you grow without fear, without shame, and without confusion. Also, leave a comment with one word that describes what you felt while watching. Awareness, conviction, clarity, or peace. That simple action reinforces what you've learned and reminds you that you're not walking this journey alone. And share this video with someone you care about, someone who may be struggling silently. The right message at the right moment can change a life, and this might be that moment.